everybody. Hope you're doing well today. Gigi Hyland, the Executive Director of the National Credit Union Foundation here. I am so excited today to be joined by Jonathan Walker, who is the Executive Director of Elevate Center for the New Middle Class. And Jonathan, welcome.
Thank you. It's great to be with you.
Thank you. It's great to have you with us. So this conversation of field notes, normally we really focus on helping credit unions understand the how of financial well-being. And Jonathan, I reached out to you to have a conversation on what your research is showing that consumers are experiencing as we go through this pandemic. And I wanted to start with kind of your signature effort, which is the research on non-prime consumers. And I've got control of slides, so I'm going to go ahead and start this out. But I think probably first of all, start with an explanation of what is Elevate? What is the Center for the New Middle Class? How do you define it? And then how are we really thinking about non-prime consumers? So go right ahead and kind of walk us through this slide, if you wouldn't mind.
Sure. So Elevate is a provider that helps banks access and service non-prime consumers and give them a better option for things like lending and borrowing options. So it provides services. Most of its business is with banks to provide that service. Several years ago, Elevate itself found that there was a lot of confusion about who the non-prime consumer was. Right. In the marketplace, there's this perception that they're either poor or they're unbanked. And we kind of realized that there was this gap in the marketplace in understanding and really appreciating the challenges of the non-prime consumer. And so we launched the Center for the New Middle Class, and it's a nonprofit research group that is just meant to do research about the non-prime consumer and share that research with anybody who's interested. And when we talk about the non-prime consumer, we're talking about people who have credit scores that do not allow them to access mainstream credit. So that's why we call them non-prime. And we call them the new middle class because they really are the bulwark of most of our communities in terms of their teachers, their educators, their accountants, their nurses in our community. And they've just kind of hit that bump in the road that means that they have credit that disallows them from a lot of mainstream options.
I think what you're saying is so important because I know, I think even, as I work with credit unions, sometimes there's a perception of, again, non-prime consumers are low or, in poorer communities. And I think this recentering, this rejiggering, not a technical term, of understanding in our case for credit unions to understand really who their members are, and that this idea of non-prime consumers and new middle class really are your day-to-day, your average member that's going to walk in the door potentially looking for credit union services. So I think having that definition is really helpful.
That is really true. And one of the things that might surprise some of your members is that our research has shown that about 15% of non-prime consumers in the country make over $100,000 a year. So, right. Certainly you get to a certain income level and it's really kind of hard not to be able to have prime credit, but that's not necessarily absolute. And so you are finding that, the average income for a non-prime household is about the national average. So you cut off a lot of the low, the really low income, and you cut off the high income, and you end up with that kind of fat middle of society. Right.
So one of the signature things that you've been doing for a while now, but certainly it feels like there's a spotlight on it as the pandemic has raged, is this idea of really tracking non-prime consumers. And I know you've got a couple of slides here that we'll walk through kind of quickly, but maybe help our listeners and our viewers understand what does this look like? What's the percentage of the population? So maybe I want to give some visuals to what you just said. So if you wouldn't mind.
Yeah, some people would be very surprised that most of our mainstream financial institutions are targeting essentially 35% of the US population.
Right.
There's a big chunk, about 1 in 5, that we call credit invisibles. They don't have enough of a credit score to be scorable. They're the very young, they're the immigrants, they're people who have checked out, right? I knew some folks who didn't have a credit score because they had eschewed all credit for about 15 years, right? And they no longer even had a score. So there's a percentage of those, but about 44% of the US population, this was TransUnion data from actually a couple of years ago, are people with credit scores in that subprime, not subprime, but so near prime, but also subprime and poor, as they say, poor. And what's interesting about that, in my view, is that this is going to get worse. There's a lot of indication, and we'll probably get through it in some of the data that we'll share today, that the prime consumers, there's going to be a bunch of prime consumers that fall back into non-prime because of this pandemic in the coming months.
And can you help with I know we talk about prime and non-prime. Can you, and I don't remember if it's on your next slide, but I'm just going to go to your next slide. What does that look like in terms of credit scores? So when we talk, we always talk about sort of what is your average person and what's their credit score. And when we talk about non-prime, what does that mean? Because for those credit union folks that are listening, they're thinking about lending and the rates that are associated with different credit scores. Can you just give sort of a broad swath of what that is when we talk about prime versus non? Yeah, that 44%, please. Yeah.
So when we defined non-prime, we made the cutoff at 700, a credit score of 700. Now we know that often, especially when we established the center a couple of years ago, we knew that 680, sometimes even 675 could get you prime credit. But we also knew, having lived through a few recessions, that what almost always happens during a recession is that lending institutions tighten up their balance sheet. They tighten up their lending and their underwriting. And so what almost always happens is that that threshold for prime credit ticks up to about 700, and sometimes in extreme places 720. And so we picked 700 because we knew that even if you were in that 680 to 700 range, you were still at risk of having the universe decide, rather than your own financial situation decide whether you could get credit.
And what's interesting, just to layer on again for the audience that'll be listening and seeing us talk about this, what's interesting here is that credit unions typically are counter-cyclical. So you see credit unions actually continuing to lend in a down time. Essentially, they build up capital when times are good, and they use that capital, and they tend to lend typically more than other financial institutions when there is a recession. So it'll be interesting as we go forward in the conversation to show our credit union audience kind of this idea, this non-prime tracker, and maybe talk a little bit about the tracker, because I find these, the sort of month over month and what you're seeing just fascinating. So maybe talk a little bit about that, please.
So back in 2018, we were looking forward and saying, hey, we are currently on the longest expansion in the American economy in more than a generation. And we said, there will be a recession. And what we don't know is what happens to people, what happens to their resilience, their financial measures during a recession. Do their financial measures predict a recession? Do we start to see the erosion of what happens to people? And so what we decided to do was to take a snapshot every single month of a collection of prime consumers and non-prime consumers, so we could see if there's a difference in what happens with them over time. Well, at the time we debated, well, is quarterly good enough? Should we do it? So we decided to go monthly. And little did we know that when the pandemic would hit, even monthly wasn't granular enough. And so what we did in March was we started taking that snapshot weekly.
Wow.
So that we could start to see what was really going on, because it was such a fast moving event. And so most of the data that we'll share with you today, we've aggregated up those weekly into a month so that we have a bigger sample base. But what this graph is meant to show you is just how rich and how longitudinal that data is. But we're not really trying to show you anything here, and we're not going to try to give you this level of granularity, although we can. If any of your members want to contact me, we're more than happy to go as granular as you want with the data that we have. But by and large, we found
said by an admitted data geek. You told me that yourself, yes. So I love that.
Yes,
it's awesome.
And I threatened Gigi that I could be here all day talking about this because there's just so much to talk about. But the point is that prior to the recession, there wasn't a huge amount of movement in some of these statistics, which kind of tells you that there was some stability there. But boy, once the pandemic hit, some things really started to move fairly dramatically.
Right. And let me go to the next slide, because I think that kind of starts to talk about this idea of, household jobs and sort of big rocks that we look at in terms of seeing the financial fragility of people and what might be changing, to your point, that are indicators that things are either getting better or things are stable or things are getting worse. So talk a little bit about the household job loss and what you've seen in the past 12 months with prime and non-prime. What is that looking like?
Yeah, what's really interesting is it's not going to surprise anybody on this webinar to know that unemployment has spiked, right? That's just more than obvious. But what's interesting about this statistic is that we were just asking about somebody in their household being affected by a job loss. And what to me is really interesting is that when you start to look at that and you start to see that, 4 in 10, right, and on the prime side, creeping up on 50% of households are being affected at some level in a way that they weren't before, really speaks to this idea of, hey, we're still only on the cusp of what's going on. And that early unemployment spike that we all hoped would be temporary, I think what we're finding is it's starting to reverberate through a lot of kind of non-service related industries, and we're starting to see that creep up. But what I think is interesting is that non-prime popped up, but seems to have been stable at this point in terms of who is which households are reporting job losses. But what is interesting is we'll have to see in the next month or two whether that number comes down and whether there's just noise in that data for the prime consumer. But the fact that we're seeing high points in that prime score seems to indicate to me that the recession is really starting to reverberate into the populations that were more stable before the economy kind of went south.
Yeah, and you're starting to see articles too, and in major newspapers. I know there was a recent article in the Wall Street Journal, I think a couple of days ago, that really talked about this idea of folks really who would qualify as prime. Sometimes attorneys or those with college degrees or advanced degrees who really are starting to see that impact of either reduced income or no income, depending upon what their work is, and that it's having this much larger ripple effect now on the economy. And your statistics are really starting to show that creeping up, that it's not what we've described it previously as potentially, restaurant workers or, frontline staff. It's really, again, the ripple effect is broadening to a much wider swath, I think, of our economy and of our population, which for credit unions is really important to consider as you think about how they will lend, how they will do potentially skip a pay, how they will try to help members stay resilient and weather this really significant crisis. Yeah. So, similarly, we talk about in the previous slide, how that's now linked to household income decrease. And if you want to sort of refer to what you're seeing here in prime in particular, which to me is fairly startling. Yeah.
Yeah. And what's interesting here is that when we asked, has their income decreased, compared to 12 months ago? So we're really asking kind of this broad swath of just in general, are you better off this year than last year in income? What you can see is while non-prime has flattened out on the the job loss side, they are continuing to lose ground on the income side in terms of where they, more of them are seeing a decrease in their income. And that increase is fairly consistent in terms of a percentage increase for the prime folks, but only about 1 in 4 households in the prime sector are saying that they've had a decrease in income in the last 12 months. But that seems to be a little bit more stable. And when we dug into those numbers a little bit more, what we found was that the prime households were more likely to, especially those that lost jobs, were more able to find new jobs or were quicker to pivot to contract working. So they were finding other ways to find that stability. And so what I think you are seeing is a bifurcation in, just who's able to be resilient and where this is happening. But we are still seeing a fairly significant percentage of the U.S. population who are, seeing their income hit fairly dramatically.
Right. I should have asked you this before, Jonathan, but as you've done this non-prime tracker in terms of the people that you are following, is it the same group that you're following? So sort of that methodology, if you can talk about that for just a minute, is this the same group that you've been following for 12 to 18 months? And maybe just help our audience understand that. Or are you surveying new people all the time? Kind of maybe just help them understand that, please.
We take a new snapshot every month. And the reason we do that is what we don't want to do. It would be great to have kind of a core of people. The one downside from a methodology standpoint to doing that, first of all, you always have about 30% attrition in a project like that. But the other reason we didn't do that is because they start to predict the questions. And so then they start anticipating, can I show that I'm better off or whatnot. And so what we wanted to do is just take a statistically significant snapshot of the prime and non-prime that we can aggregate up. We can start to look at that data because what we're most concerned about is what's happening in the larger population at any given moment or in any quarter.
Awesome. No, that's helpful to hear. We think about from a financial well-being perspective, we think about people having enough money, to get through the month, whatever that means. And this slide really talks about how many folks and the percentage of folks in the prime and non-prime are running out of money at least once in the prior 12 months. Do you want to talk a little bit about what you're seeing and sort of what this trend that you're seeing, maybe is telling us in terms of the effect of the pandemic on this sort of broader swath of the population?
Yeah. So one of the things that we've always kind of said is that the non-prime consumer figures out how to live through a recession, primarily because they kind of live a personal recession even in the good times. And you can kind of see that in this statistic where we know from the last couple of slides that they are being affected by job loss, they're being affected by the loss in income, and yet there's not any kind of statistically significant change in the percentage of them that run out of money month to month, at least once in the prior 12 months. And, that may be, part of that may be that when you have, as many of them that are doing that fairly consistently anyway, it's kind of hard to increase even more when you've got 80% of them doing it. But the reality is they figured out how to get through life the way they are. And so when their income drops, they make do. They figure out what can be cut out in order to make it to the next month. The prime folks, I think, are less, they don't understand how to live through a recession. They don't understand what that means. They're far more used to having a consistent income. So when that income hits them, you can see that there's a significantly increased number of them that are reporting running out of money. And you're seeing that is increasing month over month through the recession. And part of the reason for that is that 50% of non-prime consumers report having a fluctuating income month to month.
Yep.
So there's a big chunk of them that just understand this is the life they live. And if they run out of money if they have a decrease in income last month, they kind of know what they can pull back on and where they can get the money and how they can push and pull. The prime folks are much less likely to have a fluctuating income. And so when that income drops, they are much less resilient in understanding what they need to do, and they start to run out of money. And what I'm concerned particularly about is the fact that the prime folks, this number is increasing, which means that there are more of them being affected by this, and they're going to have to try to figure out how to make that work in the coming months. Otherwise, things are going to start to unravel for them.
So it's a really interesting, thing to think about for credit unions, because that 36% increase, is really big. I think if I ask credit unions, do you see your prime folks running out of money at least once in the prior 12 months? They probably would say no. I wouldn't think that. And I could be wrong. So my credit unions will answer me if I am wrong. But I think what you've just described is this changing two things. I think when we think about financial well-being, sometimes we lead with financial education as, we just need to educate people better about how they can make sure they don't run out of money. And certainly financial education has a really big role here. It certainly is an underpinning of financial well-being, but you need so much more than that. It's a starting point, but it's not the be all and end all necessarily. And I think this is a really good example of that, because what we're dealing with now is an income issue, is, a pandemic and the stoppage of income. And so for those that have had variable income, what I'm hearing you say, they've had that resilience to be able to sort of weather that roller coaster of variable income and understand that, next month might not be as prosperous as this month. And I have to figure out how to get through that. For those that have had, a steady paycheck, perhaps for many years, and not had that variability, it's much harder to try to pivot to a place where you then have to figure out where do you substitute and get that income. And I think it's a bellwether, I think, for credit unions to think about how can they help their members maybe figure out or help them understand, different sources of income to help them weather this. So again, I love this slide because it gives a sense of consumers' lives are changing, and how can, again, financial institutions stay abreast of that in a way that you can really serve people to try to advance their financial well-being?
Yeah, that's absolutely true. One of the things that I like to help people, one of the ways that at least money people can wrap their brain around this, right, is that the prime consumer is a gap accountant. Mm-hmm. As long as they can kind of figure out how to make sure the debits and credits work out by the end of the month, they're in pretty good shape, right? And so they use their credit card, they spend as they need to, they pay that off, and they just make sure that everything kind of evens out. The non-prime consumer is a cash accountant. They need to know what's in and what's out every single day. And so consequently, they're far more adept at understanding when they're starting to get underwater very quickly, because it happens on the day that they have an expense before, because they know when they're going to get paid. They have a good sense of what they're going to get paid. And to your point about financial education and understanding how it works is essential, but it's insufficient. Right. And the reason I say that is because 3/4 of non-prime consumers say they know the principles of budgeting. They understand it. They get it. It's not that they don't appreciate the principle of budgeting. It's that, remember, they have a fluctuating income. So if they don't know exactly what they're going to have next month, it's kind of insulting to say, well, just set your budget. Well, what if I don't have that money, right? Exactly. And so they have to adjust when those costs come in. And what's interesting is we find that our research has shown that non-prime consumers check their bank account balances 22 times a month, right? They are very aware of what's in their bank account at any given moment. And so it's not that they're irresponsible, and it's not that they are careless, and it's not that they are uninformed. They just have a different way of having to manage because they don't have the same tools that a prime person have in front of them in order to make things work month to month.
That's a great analogy between sort of GAAP and cash accounting. It's a really great visual, I think, and to help our credit union audience understand. And I think the other thing that credit unions might be able to draw from this is, when we do loans at credit unions, whether it's a mortgage or a car loan, we flatline everything. We flatline the payment. We flatline and we assume that people will have this sort of steady income that you'll be able to pay on the 10th of the month and will be the same amount. And I think, again, what this slide to me is so poignant, the story it's trying to tell is that is changing. So people's financial lives are not flatlined. Certainly for non-prime, they never have been, but for prime, it's starting to not be flatlined either. And so that idea of understanding the spikes and dips of income volatility for members and being able to design products and services and payment schedules to be able to meet members where they are in life and reflect that in a way that with technology should be doable. But it's a different way of thinking, I think, for financial institutions. It's a very different way of meeting the member where they are in life versus, yes, we do that, and our products and services still wind up being flatlined. Because we assume that you have the same thing every month, and clearly that's how we've always been organized, and that's how we should stay organized. Go ahead.
And I think that's really important to point out is that, remember, when we look at this graph and we say 2/3 of prime running out of money, it's important to realize that what the statistic isn't saying, it isn't saying they're running out every month.
Right.
And so, to your point, one of the things credit unions can be aware of is if 2/3 of your members, at least, and maybe between 2/3 and 80% of your members are going to run out of money at some point in a year. The question is, do you have tools and strategies and communication strategies in place that can catch them when that happens, even if it only happens once, right? We know that for non-prime people, it often happens about 4 times a year.
Right.
But that doesn't mean, but for prime people, it may happen only once. And, for many of them, it may just mean carrying a credit card balance in a way that they didn't, in previous months. But being more aware that this is going to happen at least once to almost everybody in your credit union kind of gives you a sense that, oh, this isn't a one-off situation. I need to design the products for at least some level of flexibility so that people can kind of overcome these bumps in the roads without completely destroying, undermining their finances. Right.
Yeah. Because and again, we'll go on to the next slide, but it's, I'm guessing for anybody, and this is not a technical word, but it feels icky to run out of money. There's the whole emotional baggage associated with, my gosh, I can't pay my bills. I have nothing. I can't pay anything. And so that opportunity, transferring what a member might be feeling about money and running out of money, transferring that and transmogrifying it into an opportunity for a credit union to say, we've got your back and we know this happens at least once every 12 months. It's a great opportunity to build that loyalty and to build that sense of, we're your trusted financial partner and we're with you on this. So I don't want to beat this particular slide into a bloody dead horse, but this is a really important one just to help, I think, credit unions understand. So let's move on in terms of this idea of, we talked about the income flow, but let's also talk about the expense side of the house and what you've been seeing in the non-prime tracker as a result. So please, Jonathan.
Yeah. So, obviously one of the hallmarks of the American economy in the last probably generation is that because so much of our month-to-month income is being assumed in things like housing, education, healthcare, all of these things are more expensive as a percentage of people's income than they were a generation ago. And all that means is there's less room in people's budget for that extraordinary expense that hits them. And so one of the reasons we really felt it was important to track extraordinary expenses that disrupt finances, not just extraordinary expenses that happen. If you can absorb them, they didn't disrupt your finances. We want to know at what point they disrupted your finances. And the reason we feel like that's important to track is because if that starts to go up, it means that those households are really starting to have less and less capacity to absorb the shocks that normally hit them. And you can see once again, the non-prime consumers just kind of have that figured out, right? They know that when an expense comes in, they just have to kind of absorb it somehow. And so for them, the idea of a disrupting extraordinary expense is less likely to hit them, even as their finances are maybe more fragile because of a decreased income. But on the prime side, you're starting to see this tick up fairly consistently, that there's more people are reporting that extraordinary expense that is disrupting their finances month to month. And that is really important for financial institutions to understand, is that often these extraordinary expenses are just one-time events, but they can ripple into the future if they can't absorb them right now. And let me just say that we had a follow-up question to this that was an open-ended follow-up question that said, well, what was the extraordinary expense that disrupted your finance? And it becomes this really interesting window into the world of American household finances when you start to see what they said. And if you'd like, I'll just read verbatim.
Oh, please. No. Yeah, I think that's really important.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Owing in taxes, car repairs, less hours at my hourly wage job, root canal procedure, being sued by a debt collector, having a baby, medical emergency, unexpected funeral expenses. These are, I could go on and on. These are just the first ones I came across.
Wow.
As I looked at, I didn't cherry pick some really interesting ones. The first few pages, I pulled some. Now, a big chunk of them are medical expenses.
Yeah.
And I just only picked a couple of those. But, some of them talked about being broke because of COVID-19 or health problems. So this gives you an idea of the kinds of events that are happening that institutions like credit unions are very adept at being able to help people kind of overcome these moments that really could echo into people's financial futures if they don't take care of them the right way.
I think those examples are striking in their normalcy.
Yeah.
Is what I would underscore, is that is life happening. And to the extent that people are on a financial course and get bumped off that course because of one single life event, again, is a flag and alert, I think, for credit unions and other financial institutions to really think about how do you design your financial well-being strategy around offering people the resiliency tools they need when life happens, when something like that happens, whether it's a cancer diagnosis or just recovering from COVID-19 or needing 4 new tires on your car, whatever it is, that event of life. How can credit unions really think about that as this happens day in and day out, and that people are saying it happens day in and day out, but that's the one thing that might push them off track. So it's an opportunity. So that's great data. And I think, again, the normalcy of those responses in those life events, they're not life events. They're not massive life events. They're just life period. And I think that's really important to underscore.
What is really important to recognize is that a root canal procedure, you're right, is normal. And whether it disrupts my finances probably has more to do with what else is going on, right? And that's one of the challenges. I think one of the reasons this has gone up is not because the pandemic has caused more root canals, right? This idea that disrupted my finances is because I am currently at a little less income than I normally am used to.
Yeah.
And a root canal doesn't care whether I have a job or not. It's ready to be taken care of now, right?
Exactly.
And so, to your point, one of the challenges that we see is that some of these things happen as a 1-2 punch.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why it disrupts their finances. They're not being irresponsible. A lot of these people talk about, I have money saved up. It just wasn't enough for everything that hit me when it hit me.
Right. No, I think that's a great point. And as you were talking, I'm hearkening back to the great JP Morgan Chase Institute research of how people use their tax refunds, and the finding that really within the first 2 weeks, about 60% of that is being used for deferred healthcare. This idea that I don't have the slack right now to do the things that I might do to keep myself healthy, like even just plain going to the dentist or getting that mammogram or getting a checkup, because I don't have the money to maybe pay for the deductible or the copay. And that all that deferred healthcare means that people are waiting to do the things that might actually avoid the root canal because they didn't tend to it in time. So there's just for credit unions who are listening, it's just, I want to underscore that all of this winds up being connected. That is, you defer healthcare, that is, you have healthcare expenses, that affects finances, it affects your ability to work sometimes. It winds up being this cycle that people can get into, which is that 1-2 punch that you were talking about. Yeah. So savings accounts, savings are sort of the holy grail, we know, for people to have this sense of financial stability. And how is your research on the non-prime tracker considered savings account ownership?
Yeah, and this is another one where we start to be concerned about the prime folks.
Yep.
I think what we're seeing here is people through the recession, 2/3 of people had savings accounts. And when we say that, I think what they were interpreting is, I have money in a savings account.
Right.
I have a savings. And you look at that first number, that 67%, that is the pre-COVID average. Remember, that's a year and a half's worth of data. So that's a pretty consistent 67% when you think of that aggregated up. And the fact that it has now eroded down to only 50% of prime folks are reporting that they feel like they have that savings account in there tells you that this is starting to erode. And what I think is interesting about the non-prime tracker is you can see that March to April, it kind of eroded and jumped. And it's very interesting that our data shows that that's the same time people were getting those stimulus checks.
Right.
And so there's some reality to why that bump happens where it did. And the fact that this is consistently eroding for the prime makes me very concerned that they are going to start to miss payments and struggle a little bit more if they can't get on top of this before everything kind of unravels for them. They're kind of, I feel like they're racing against the clock, and some of them are falling behind if they're not careful. You look at the non-prime folks, once again, they're kind of used to this. This is how they live their life. And so they're far more consistent. And those that had savings account seems to be kind of holding steady and continuing with that.
Right. Now, really interesting again, and underscoring some of the things that we've talked about for credit unions to start paying attention to. This idea of financial insecurity, and this, we know that money oftentimes is a lot about how you feel about money as well. This idea of how you behave is often driven by the emotions that you have around money. And how does this feeling about money, how are you seeing this change over time? And again, particularly with the pandemic.
Yeah, and this is a really interesting question. This idea of financial security and how secure you feel, because we're trying to look at it year over year. So we said, compared to a year ago, do you feel more or less secure than you did before? And there's a level of kind of discomfort that I have that 1 in 3 non-prime consumers in the best economy that we've had in a generation, we're still feeling less secure than they did the year before. And that is an issue that we as a society have to figure out. How in an economy that was roaring, did we still find that? And what's interesting is that we're seeing a lot of spikes here, and the financial insecurity of the non-prime folks have significantly increased. And it kind of increases based on kind of what's happening in the news right now. And that's a snapshot that happens with people. And the prime folks had a really bad April, right? I think some of that might be noise in the data, but that's a lot of respondents. Remember, we're capturing 4 times a month that snapshot. So that average at 25% says that was probably the low point in the economy when people really didn't know where they were going to sit. The economy hadn't opened up at all at that point. Right. Everybody was locked inside. What is interesting is that it kind of bopped back down where we expected. And now we're starting to be a little bit worried again in August. And we'll see what those September numbers start to pop out with. But it's interesting that this idea of financial insecurity is one that it's a little bit harder to get your arms around because of how people react.
Right. Yeah. And can change certainly, day over day, week over week. But I think, again, not to be ignored is this trend that you're seeing on both sets of consumers, non-prime and prime. You're seeing a pretty steady increase of that level of insecurity, and whether that is because, again, this is an income stoppage and there's not yet any additional sort of promise of an infusion of income, from the government or otherwise, that are people just starting to feel that angst again of like, oh my gosh, I really don't know what's coming. Again, just good information for credit unions to have in terms of the mental state of their members as they come in and say, how can you help me with this?
As credit unions, you guys have a really good opportunity to really understand what's happening in those savings accounts, right? And you can see whether or not you're more or less exposed to people, if your members have more of that exposure. Now that this data is here, there's a benchmark that you can compare it to, right? So you can start to look at your own data and say, do our members, are they more or less fragile than what the Center for the New Middle Class's data is saying is happening nationwide? And that gives you a sense for kind of what your members might need relative to the US population. And I know one of the biggest challenges that any company has is understanding whether my consumers, my customers, my members are fundamentally different than others. Do I need to react differently? Do I need to provide them different solutions? And that's hopefully one thing that the Center for the New Middle Class can provide, is at least a benchmark of data that you can look at and say, well, what are we seeing within our own organization? And right now we are publishing new reports every single month based on what we're seeing with the non-prime tracker. But we have all sorts of other reports that we have done about, gender, ethnicity, age group, situational things like healthcare finances and whatnot. So there's a lot of information there to get a sense for how the non-prime as well as the prime, because it's a comparison. Almost all of these studies are comparison to give you a sense of where you stand.
No, that's great. So let me stop sharing, because I think that's kind of the last slide that we had that really gives a good view of that. I think kind of to wrap up this conversation, Jonathan, I think we are, credit unions, all of us, we're so overwhelmed with data. We have all of these data sources and there's a lot of noise out there. And help me distill for the credit unions that are listening, how should they think about using what we just presented to them? And you've given them one idea in terms of comparing what you've got as a non-prime tracker with what they're actually seeing happen in savings accounts with their prime and non-prime members. I think, how do we use the data, I don't want to say the right way, but in a way that combines the trends that we're seeing with the sort of the humanity of the members that are actually coming in the door for credit unions. So what other pieces of advice would you have, in addition to the great one that you just provided, of how credit unions should really use this to be actionable to serve people as we all, try to weather through this really tough crisis.
Yeah. Well, every organization probably has different capabilities in terms of kind of deep analytics they're capable of doing, and doing a behavioral segmentation on what's actually happening with your consumers and where they sit and how they're moving is always valuable. One of the things I will say is data like ours can kind of give you a jump start on that, right? Because you can start to see, there are people who are low on income, have an expense. Can I find them in my database? So there's this sense that somebody else, we've kind of shown some of this data about what's going on. And now you can go in and find those people and then start to identify, do we just track them or do we provide them solutions? Do we proactively talk to them differently? One of the things that I've done in my career is really started to look at how do we talk to people differently so that they will react in such a way that reinforces what we want them to do. Right. And one of the things that we can do is just acknowledge that some of these things are happening. And if we talk to our consumers slightly differently, encourage them to contact us, right? Sometimes we're really uncomfortable about advertising that we can defer your payments because we're afraid everybody's going to do it and then things start to collapse, right? And that's a fair concern. And so the question is, how do you communicate with your members in such a way that it becomes something that triggers an awareness to the people who need it, right? Hey, please contact us when you're running into issues. We may be able to help you. We don't tell them necessarily what we'll help them with, but it gives them a sense that we are here, we're willing to work with them because we recognize. And if you do that segmentation a little bit, you might even be able to push those messages out to people whose savings accounts have dropped 40% in the last 2 or 3 months, so that they recognize that you're talking to them slightly differently.
No, I think that's really great advice. The humanity of this is, and what I'm hearing you say as the foundational piece is, talk to your people, talk to your members, even talk to your employees of what they're seeing in their own communities and their own life. Employees are a great sort of beta or focus group for you to really see what your members are going through. And obviously, as they're frontline staff is dealing with members, they can really see that and tell those stories and alert, I think, the credit union to react pretty quickly with that data in a way that's that meets, again, I use this term all the time, but meets people where they are in life. And I love what you're saying that, even just knowing that my credit union kind of has a clue that my income might be going down and I'm a prime consumer, that's a big deal because for the most part, my first inclination wouldn't be to tell a credit union that my income is going down. So even that, hey, we know that life is really hard right now. And if you need to talk to us, we're here, we've got your back. I think that sense of, because there's so much noise in the financial services space and people are thinking about money every day, whether they're non-prime or prime right now. Before they're probably thinking of prime, we're probably thinking about those big life events, the wedding and the having kids and the retirement and the mortgage. Now it's like, oh my gosh, every day, every week, I really need to think about what I'm doing with my money. And who should I trust to talk about this? Yeah.
And one of the interesting things is those life events are so important, right? Right. Credit is absolutely essential. You can't build your personal assets if you can't get access to buying a house and whatnot. And those things are really important, and we pay attention to them because they are important. What we sometimes forget is there are asset eroding events that can really destroy someone's finances if we don't recognize that, hey, this person had a root canal and it cost them $2,000. They don't have $2,000. And that is going to likely cause them to either take out a loan on their 401k or it's going to cause them to miss payments on something else, which will hurt their income, hurt their credit scores, which will cost them money in the future. There are all these kinds of things that happen that potentially hurt one's assets that we don't often really think of as really good moments to as a financial institution to step in and provide a solution for people because they can get over that hump. Because we're often hyper aware of when a person's finances erode enough that we don't dare lend them money. And we should. We need to be concerned about those. But when can we step in before that moment happens, before everything starts to cascade and we no longer have the ability to lend them money? Can we lend them money earlier in that process to help them? And the reason I say that is because we did a study, last year, a little while ago, and we asked people, do they like their financial institution? And both prime and non-prime said that they really liked their banks and credit unions. They trusted them. All these, they liked them, they trusted them, they liked working with them. So it's not like they don't have an engagement there, but things started to erode when we asked them, well, do they have products? Do they understand you? And non-prime people said, fewer of them than prime said that their financial institution understood them. And then we said, do they have products for them? And it collapsed. And the non-prime folks said, no, my financial institution does not have products for me. So they want to work with these financial institutions. They trust them. They like working with them. But there is a disconnect on whether they think those financial institutions even have products for them. And part of that may be how we communicate. If we do have products for them, how do we communicate in such a way that that we're there even at those moments and not just at the, invest for my retirement moments?
That is such an important point. And Jonathan, in a previous conversation, you and I were talking about this in the context of small dollar loans, and you asked me, do credit unions still offer loans like, $200 or $300 or $2,000 for that root canal that we keep talking about? And my answer is yes. Credit unions have always done that. They continue to do that. And your challenge back to me was, but does a non-prime member know that? And the answer might be no. I think it's a really good question for the credit unions listening. And I love, again, your point, I'm just going to underscore that point of, are you communicating what you do to all the people who might need your services and what they need right then and there? So for a non-prime consumer that has that root canals, I've got to take care of it. I have no choice, but I don't have the $2,000 to pay for it. Can you meet that person where they are right then? And can you meet a prime member where he or she is right now in the face of, oh my gosh, I'm losing my income. I don't know. I didn't even know that potentially I could skip a payment as an example. So just really great advice all the way through. Like you, I could talk about this all day long. I love hearing all of the research that you've done and all of the resources I think that credit unions probably aren't aware of that they can use to help find ways to navigate point to point during this crisis. Because this is all new for all of us. This is brand new territory, but I think experimenting, trying things, reaching out and finding ways to use the data is really important for credit unions. So, Jonathan, thank you for your time. We'll make sure to make all these resources available and provide them. So thank you again for being with us.
Fantastic. Gigi, it's always a pleasure to chat with you and thank you for your time, and everybody stay safe out there.